In the untamed territories of the American West, a young woman's life crumbles beneath her father's iron will. Forced into marriage with one of the most notorious outlaws in the territory, she faces a future chained to a man whose mere name strikes terror in the hearts of settlers and lawmen alike. Her dreams of freedom seem to vanish like morning mist under the harsh frontier sun. But destiny has different plans. When a mysterious cowboy, hardened by years on the frontier, yet guided by an unwavering moral compass, crosses her path, everything changes. Now they're both running for their lives, pursued across the savage wilderness by not only her murderous outlaw husband, but also her father's relentless men, while an unexpected love blooms in the shadow of danger. Will their desperate bid for freedom cost them everything, including each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Mitchell ranch as Sarah worked the brush through her horse's mane, each stroke methodical and purposeful. Dawn was her sanctuary, the only time she truly felt free from her father's watchful eye. The sprawling ranch, with its 1,000 acres of prime Texas grazing land, had once been her playground. Now at 20, it felt more like a gilded cage. Thunder, her bay stallion, nickered softly as she worked, his warm breath visible in the cool morning air. Sarah pressed her forehead against his neck, inhaling the familiar scent of hay and horse. That had been her comfort since childhood. Since her mother's passing 7 years ago, these quiet moments with Thunder were often her only solace. "Sarah!" Her father's voice cracked through the morning stillness like a whip. "Get in here, girl. There's business to discuss." Thomas Mitchell's voice carried the weight of authority earned through decades of expanding his cattle empire. Other ranchers spoke his name with a mixture of respect and fear, but few knew the man behind closed doors. Sarah knew both sides intimately, the shrewd businessman who had built the largest ranch in 3 counties, and the father whose love had twisted into something resembling ownership after her mother's death. She gave Thunder a final pat and squared her shoulders. The wooden steps of the main house creaked beneath her boots as she climbed to the porch, each sound a countdown to another confrontation. Inside, her father stood at his massive oak desk, papers spread before him like battle plans. The morning light through the window caught the silver in his hair, but did nothing to soften the hard lines of his face. "Wilson's signed over there." "Water rights," he announced without preamble, tapping a document with one thick finger. "That's the 3rd piece of land this month. By winter, we'll control every water source from here to the Miller Creek." Sarah's stomach tightened. She knew what signed over usually meant. Families pressured until they had no choice but to sell. She'd seen too many neighbors leave with empty wagons and hollow eyes. Did they want to sell, father? His sharp glance told her she'd stepped too far. Want has nothing to do with it. This is business. The strong survive, the weak move on. Your mother never understood that either. The mention of her mother stung like salt in an old wound. Catherine Mitchell had been everything Sarah aspired to be, gentle but strong, kind but resolute. The fever that took her had left more than an empty space at the dinner table. It had carved a void in Thomas Mitchell that he filled with ambition and control. "Speaking of business," he continued, shuffling through his papers, "we're having guests for dinner tonight, important guests. Wear that blue dress your mother loved, and do something with your hair. You look like you've been rolling in the hay." Sarah touched her wind-tangled hair self-consciously. She knew better than to argue about the dress, though the thought of wearing her mother's favorite made her chest ache. "Who's coming?" "Jake Harrison and his associates." Her father's tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp on her face. "He's got interests in several territories. Smart man, understands the importance of strategic alliances." The name sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Everyone knew Jake the Snake Harrison, or at least they knew the stories. Cattle that disappeared in the night, ranches that mysteriously burned after refusing his protection, men who spoke against him and were never seen again. That her father would do business with such a man spoke volumes about how far he'd strayed from the principles he'd once taught her. Sarah turned to leave, her mind already racing with the implications of this dinner, but her father's voice stopped her at the door. "Sarah." She looked back to find him staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're all I have left of her. Everything I do, the ranch, the expansion, all of it, it's for your future. You understand that? Don't you?" For a moment, she saw a flicker of the father she remembered. The man who had taught her to ride, who had held her through nightmares, who had loved her mother with a passion that lit up every room they shared. But then his face hardened again, and she knew her answer didn't matter. Thomas Mitchell had already decided what was best for her future, just as he decided everything else. "Yes, father," she said quietly, and left to prepare for a dinner that would change her life forever. The blue dress felt like a shroud against Sarah's skin as she stood at her bedroom window, watching dust clouds approach from the distance. 3 riders, their shapes distorted by the setting sun. Even from here, she could distinguish Jake Harrison's silhouette, tall and lean like a predator stalking its prey. Stories about the snake had circulated through every saloon and general store in the territory. Last month, Mary Cooper, the shopkeeper's wife, had whispered about Harrison's latest victim, a rancher who'd refused to pay protection money. They'd found the man's cattle slaughtered, his barn burned, and him hanging from his own windmill. The local sheriff had ruled it suicide, but everyone knew better. Nobody crossed the snake and lived to tell about it. "They're here," Rosa, their housekeeper, announced from the doorway. The older woman's face was pinched with worry, her weathered hands twisting her apron. She'd helped raise Sarah after Catherine's death, and her maternal instincts were screaming warnings. "Your father wants you downstairs." Sarah smoothed her skirts, her fingers trembling slightly. "How many guests, Rosa?" 3. Harrison and 2 of his men. Rosa stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I don't like this, Mijita. That man, he has dead eyes, like a rattler before it strikes." The comparison was apt. Sarah had seen Harrison once before, at a distance during last year's cattle auction. He'd stood apart from the crowd, watching everything with cold calculation. Men gave him a wide berth, like prey animals sensing a predator in their midst. Heavy bootsteps echoed from downstairs, followed by her father's forced laugh, too loud, too eager to please. Sarah took a deep breath and descended the stairs. Rosa's cross touching her back in a silent blessing. The scene in the parlor froze her blood. Jake Harrison stood by the fireplace, his black coat dusty from the trail, but somehow making him look more dangerous rather than disheveled. His eyes found her immediately, a predatory gleam that made her skin crawl. At 40, he was twice her age, but it wasn't his years that troubled her. It was the cold calculation in his gaze as he assessed her like a piece of property. "Miss Mitchell," he drawled, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "your father's descriptions didn't do you justice." His smile never reached his eyes. Thomas Mitchell beamed with pride, either ignorant of or choosing to ignore the threat emanating from his guest. "Sarah, come meet Mr. Harrison properly. He's been telling me about his operations in the New Mexico territory." Operations. Such a clean word for what everyone knew was a criminal empire built on extortion and blood. Harrison's 2 men, hard-faced cowboys with gun-calloused hands, watched the exchange with poorly concealed amusement. "A pleasure, Mr. Harrison," Sarah managed, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She'd learned from her father how to wear masks in business dealings. "Please call me Jake." He stepped closer, and Sarah fought the urge to retreat. "I have a feeling we'll be getting to know each other very well." The way he said it made her blood run cold. She glanced at her father, but he was busy pouring drinks, his movements too precise, too deliberate. He was nervous, she realized. Thomas Mitchell, who had faced down rustlers and rival ranchers without flinching, was afraid of Jake Harrison. "Dinner is served," Rosa announced from the doorway, her timing perfect as always. The meal that followed was an exercise in contained terror. Harrison dominated the conversation, speaking of his various business interests with carefully crafted vagueness. His men, introduced as Bart and Tucker, ate in predatory silence, their eyes constantly scanning the room. Sarah pushed food around. Her plate, her appetite gone, as Harrison's gaze repeatedly returned to her with increasing possessiveness. "Your daughter's quite the accomplished young lady, Thomas," Harrison remarked over dessert. "Beautiful, well-mannered, clearly intelligent. A man could build an empire with a wife like that." The fork trembled in Sarah's hand. Her father's response was lost in the roaring of blood in her ears. She knew then, with horrible certainty, why Harrison was really here. This wasn't just a business dinner, it was a negotiation for her future. As if confirming her fears, Harrison raised his glass in her direction, his smile as deadly as a coiled rattlesnake. "To new partnerships," he said, his meaning clear, "and to the future Mrs. Harrison." Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat at her window, watching Harrison's men patrol the ranch grounds like prison guards. Her childhood home had become a cage in the space of a single evening. The moon cast long shadows across the yard, and in each one she saw the shape of her future closing in around her. Before her mother died, there had been dreams. She'd planned to attend school back east, like her cousin Emily, maybe even teach someday. Catherine had encouraged these aspirations, secretly putting aside money from her household allowance. The small stack of saved dollars still lay hidden. In Sarah's drawer, wrapped in her mother's handkerchief, now nothing more than a bitter reminder of futures lost. A soft knock at her door startled her. "Enter," she called, quickly wiping her eyes. Rosa slipped in, carrying a cup of tea. Her face was grave in the lamplight. "Your father is still in his study with that devil," she whispered, pressing the warm cup into Sarah's hands. "They're drawing up papers." Papers. The word felt like ash in her mouth. "Marriage contract." Rosa spat the words like a curse. "That snake wants the wedding done by week's end." The teacup clattered against its saucer. "Week's end. But that's only 3 days away. He says he has business in Santa Fe that can't wait." Rosa's hands were gentle on Sarah's shoulders. "Majita, we must get you out of here. I have cousins in Mexico." "He'd find me." Sarah's voice was hollow. "You know what he does to people who cross him. I won't put your family at risk." Dawn found Sarah at her father's study door, her nightdress exchanged for a riding habit. She'd always been able to reason with him before, even in his darkest moods. But when she entered, one look at his face told her this time would be different. "It's done," Thomas Mitchell said without preamble. "The contracts are signed. Harrison's offering a generous bride price, enough to secure water rights all the way to the state line." He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Bride price." Sarah's voice shook with rage and disbelief. "I'm your daughter, not a piece of cattle to be sold at auction. This is business, Sarah, a strategic alliance that will secure both our futures." He shuffled papers on his desk. "Harrison can protect what we've built, expand it, with his connections. His connections to thieves and murderers." The words burst from her. "Mother would never have allowed this." The blow came so fast, she hardly saw it coming. Her father had never struck her before. They stood frozen, both shocked by the red mark spreading across her cheek. "Your mother," he said finally, his voice deadly quiet, "is not here. I am. And you'll do as you're told." Sarah fled to the stables, her sanctuary since childhood. Thunder sensed her distress, nickering softly as she threw his saddle on with shaking hands. She had one chance. If she could reach the sheriff in town, surely he would. "Going somewhere, Miss Mitchell?" She whirled to find Bart, one of Harrison's men, blocking the stable door. His hand rested casually on his gun belt. "Just exercising thunder before breakfast," she managed. "Boss thought you might try something foolish." Bart's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Said to remind you he's got men watching every road between here and Mexico. Shame if something happened to that pretty horse of yours. Or to Rosa's family down south." The threat was clear. Sarah's shoulders slumped in defeat as Bart led Thunder back to his stall. She watched helplessly as he removed the saddle. her last hope of escape disappearing with each piece of tack he stripped away. Back in her room, Sarah found a dress box on her bed. Inside lay a wedding gown of finest white silk, obviously ordered weeks ago. Her father had planned this all along. A note in Harrison's angular handwriting lay atop the fabric. "A gift for my bride. I trust you'll wear it with appropriate gratitude. Your loving fiancé, Jake." Sarah ran her fingers over the silk, imagining it wrapping around her throat like a noose. In 3 days, she would walk down the aisle of the local church, and Jake the Snake Harrison would slide a ring onto her finger like a shackle. Unless God himself intervened, Sarah Mitchell would become Mrs. Jake Harrison, and in doing so, she would die inside just as surely as if Harrison had put one of his bullets through her heart. The church bells tolled like a funeral dirge. Sarah stood before the chapel mirror, a stranger in white silk staring back at her. The wedding dress fit perfectly. Of course it did. Harrison had been planning this for months, probably had her. Measurements taken without her knowledge. Even her reflection looked trapped, pale and drawn, despite Rosa's best efforts with rouge and powder. "It's time, daughter." Thomas Mitchell's voice carried none of its usual authority. For the first time, he sounded old. The small church was packed with faces she knew, neighbors, townspeople, ranch hands. Some wore expressions of pity, others couldn't meet her eyes. Harrison's men lined the walls, a clear message to anyone considering interference. At the altar, the snake waited in his finest black suit, looking every bit the respectable businessman. Only his eyes betrayed him, cold and possessive, as they tracked her slow walk down the aisle. "Dearly beloved," the priest's words washed over her like distant waves. Sarah focused on the stained glass window behind him, its colors bleeding together through her unshed tears. A dove trapped in flight, forever frozen in colored glass. How fitting. Harrison's hand was dry and cold when he took hers. The gold ring felt like a brand as he slid it onto her finger, his grip tightening when she instinctively tried to pull away. "With this ring I thee wed," he said, loud enough for all to hear. His thumb stroked her palm, a gesture of ownership, not affection. "I do," Sarah whispered when prompted, the words tasting like ash. What choice did she have? Harrison's men had made it clear what would happen to Rosa's family, to Thunder, to anyone she cared about if she refused. The reception was held at the Mitchell Ranch, the yard transformed with bunting and flowers. Sarah sat beside her new husband, watching him charm the guests with practiced ease. To most, he appeared the perfect gentleman, gracious, wealthy, devoted to his young bride. Only she felt the steel beneath his gentle touches, saw the threats behind his loving smiles. "Dance with me, wife," Harrison commanded as the fiddles struck up a tune. He led her onto the makeshift dance floor, one hand proprietary on her waist. "You've made me a very happy man today," he murmured in her ear. "Your father's water rights are just a bonus. I've had my eye on you since the cattle auction last year. Such spirit, such fire." His grip tightened. "I look forward to taming that fire." The sun was setting when Harrison finally led her to the waiting carriage. Her bags had already been packed and loaded. She wouldn't be allowed a last night in her childhood home. Rosa pressed a small bundle into her hands as she passed, whispering a prayer in Spanish. Sarah clutched it like a lifeline, knowing it contained her mother's photograph and the sad little stack of saved dollars. "To new beginnings," Harrison announced, to the cheering crowd, helping her into the carriage. As they pulled away, Sarah caught a last glimpse of her father. He stood alone on the porch, shoulders slumped, finally seeing the true cost of his ambition. The carriage rattled through the gathering darkness. Harrison sat opposite her, his features shadowed, watching her with those snake-like eyes. A voice called out from the darkness, one of his scouts reporting the road ahead was clear. "Get some rest, Mrs. Harrison," he said, testing out her new name. "It's a long ride to our new home." His smile showed teeth in the darkness. "And tomorrow we begin your education in being a proper wife." Sarah turned to the window. letting her tears fall silently as her childhood home disappeared into the night. The golden ring on her finger caught the last light of day, gleaming like a shackle. She was Jake Harrison's wife now, bound by law and church and her father's cruel ambition. Unless God himself intervened, this was her life now. A bird, in a gilded cage, married to a snake. The first rays of dawn painted the desert sky when the sound of gunfire shattered the morning silence. The carriage lurched to a halt, throwing Sarah against the opposite seat. Harrison was already moving, his revolver appearing in his hand like a magic trick. "Stay here," he ordered, voice cold with fury. More shots rang out, followed by shouts and the thunder of hooves. Through the carriage window, Sarah glimpsed figures moving in the dusty morning light. Harrison's men taking defensive positions, returning fire at unseen attackers. For a wild moment, she wondered if her father had changed his mind, sent men to rescue her, but Thomas Mitchell wasn't the type to go back on a deal no matter the cost. A horse screamed in pain. Someone cursed. Then, cutting through the chaos, a new voice rang out, deep, authoritative, with a hint of Texas drawl. "That's enough. I got 3 rifles trained on your driver, Harrison. Let's talk business." Sarah peered through the dust. A lone rider sat atop a black stallion, silhouetted against the rising sun. Unlike Harrison's men, he wore no gun belt. Bristling with weapons, just a single revolver on his hip and a rifle across his saddle, Harrison stepped into view, keeping his body between the stranger and the carriage. "You're either brave or stupid, mister. Do you know who I am? Jake the Snake Harrison." The stranger's voice carried a note of contempt. "Terror of 3 territories, or so they say. Right now, you're the man about to lose his driver and 2 best men unless we come to an arrangement." A tense silence followed. Sarah held her breath, heart pounding. Through the window, she could see Harrison's shoulders tighten. He was calculating odds, counting guns. "What kind of arrangement?" Harrison finally asked. "Simple. I've got papers saying that carriage was stolen. Wanted in 3 counties. The stranger's tone was casual, almost friendly. "Now, I'm a reasonable man. Turn it over, we forget this happened." Harrison's laugh was ugly. "The carriage stays. So does everything in it." "Everything?" The stranger shifted in his saddle, and for the first time, Sarah caught a glimpse of his face, weathered by sun and wind, but younger than his voice suggested. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, flicked briefly to the carriage window. "That's not what I heard. Word is you're traveling with unwilling company." Sarah's heart skipped. He knew. Somehow this stranger knew about her situation. "My wife," Harrison snarled, "travels of her own free will. We were married yesterday. Ask anyone in town. A church wedding doesn't make it right." The stranger's voice hardened. "Let her decide, Harrison. Her choice here and now." For a moment, hope flared in Sarah's chest. Then Harrison's next words extinguished it. "Try anything, and my men in town will pay a visit to certain families. You understand my meaning?" The stranger was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different note, one of quiet promise rather than threat. "Another? A time then, ma'am," he called louder. "Remember this day. Remember there's always a choice." With that, he wheeled his horse around. Sarah caught one last glimpse of him, straight-backed and proud in the saddle, before he disappeared into the rising sun. His men melted away with him, leaving no trace they'd ever been there. Harrison yanked the carriage door open, his face twisted with rage. "Friend of your father's?" Sarah shook her head, unable to speak. The stranger's words echoed in her mind. "Remember, there's always a choice." "Get moving!" Harrison shouted to his driver. As the carriage lurched forward, he settled opposite Sarah, his eyes never leaving her face. "Don't get any ideas, wife. That was just some glory-seeking fool. He won't try again." But Sarah saw the lie in his eyes. For the first time since the wedding, she felt something stir in her chest. A dangerous, fragile thing called hope. Harrison's ranch sprawled across 1,000 acres of New Mexico territory, a fortress disguised as a cattle operation. The main house perched on a hill like a vulture's nest, offering views of anyone approaching for miles. Sarah spent her first week as Mrs. Harrison learning its boundaries, both visible and invisible. She couldn't go riding without an escort, couldn't visit town alone, couldn't even write letters without Harrison reading them first. The servants, all Harrison's people, watched her every move, but they couldn't stop her from observing, from learning the rhythm of the place. Every Tuesday, supplies came from town. Every Thursday, Harrison met with his business associates, men who arrived after dark and left before dawn. And every morning, like clockwork, the young stable hand mucked out the stalls while singing trail songs in a familiar Texas drawl. It took Sarah 3 days to realize why that voice struck her as familiar. When she finally slipped away to the stables on the pretense of checking her old mare, the only piece of her previous life Harrison had allowed her to keep, her heart nearly stopped. The stable hand straightened up from his work, and though his face was different, partially hidden by a thick beard, those eyes were unmistakable. The stranger from the ambush. "Ma'am," he touched his hat, his voice carefully neutral. Just another ranch hand doing his job. But as he passed her, he pressed something into her hand, a crumpled piece of paper hidden in a handful of fresh straw. Back in her room, hands trembling, Sarah smoothed out the note. "Friends are watching. Be ready. When the time comes, be near. Your horse at midnight." She burned the note in her candle, watching the ashes float away like her prayers. That night at dinner, Harrison boasted about his new stable hand, Will Turner, supposedly from a ranch in Texas. "Good with horses," he said between bites. "Though a bit simple, doesn't talk much." Sarah kept her eyes on her plate, fighting to keep her expression neutral. Inside, her mind raced. The stranger, Will, had somehow infiltrated Harrison's operation. But why? Was he a lawman, a rival outlaw, or something else entirely? Over the next few days, they developed a subtle language of their own. A hummed tune meant Harrison was away. A dropped horseshoe meant his men were planning something. Each morning, Sarah found tiny notes hidden in her mare's stall. Sometimes just a word or two, but each one a lifeline to the outside world. 3. New men arrived last night. Bad ones. Harrison planning big meeting next week. Got word about Rosa's family. They're safe. That last one nearly brought her to tears. She'd been sick with worry about Rosa's relatives in Mexico, knowing Harrison's threats weren't idle. Somehow, Will had reached them, protected them. But Harrison wasn't a fool. Sarah caught him watching her sometimes, his eyes calculating. He noticed how often she visited the stables, though she was careful to make each trip seem reluctant, as if the mare was her only comfort in her new life. It wasn't even a lie, just not the whole truth. "Sweet thing," he said one evening, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder that made her skin crawl. "You spend so much time with that horse. Perhaps we should sell it, give you more time to focus on wifely duties." "Please," she whispered, hating the tremor in her voice, but knowing it would please him. "She's all I have left of home." He smiled, satisfied with her show of submission. "Very well, keep your pet. For now." That night, she found a longer message wrapped in her mare's blanket. "Harrison's planning something big. Army payroll coming. Through next week, he'll be distracted. Stay alert. Almost time." Sarah's hands shook as she memorized the words before destroying them. Hope was a dangerous thing in Harrison's world. It could get you killed as surely as a bullet. But like a seed taking root in desert soil, it grew in her heart. Unstoppable. Each morning, she watched Will work with the horses, his capable hands, gentle with the animals, even as they delivered messages that could get them both killed. Each evening, she sat across from Harrison at dinner, wearing the mask of the obedient wife, while silently planning her escape. And each night, she dreamed of freedom, of riding away from this gilded prison with the mysterious stranger who'd brought hope back into her world. But dreams, she knew, could be as dangerous as hope in the snake's den. Will's back burned with awareness as he worked in the stables, Harrison's men watching him with increasing suspicion. 2 weeks of playing the simple stable hand had yielded more information than he'd expected, but also more danger than he'd bargained for. The snake's operation went deeper than anyone had suspected. It wasn't just cattle rustling and protection rackets. Harrison had his fingers in everything: gun running, army supply theft, even land deeds mysteriously transferred after owners disappeared. The ledger Will had discovered hidden in the barn office told a story of corruption reaching all the way to the territorial governor, but it was Sarah who complicated everything. Will had come here with a badge hidden in his saddlebag and a mission to bring down Harrison's operation. He hadn't counted on her, on the quiet strength in her eyes, the careful way she carried herself, like someone used to walking through a room full of rattlers. Every time he slipped her a note, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment, he felt the weight of her trust, the responsibility of it. "Turner!" Bart's voice cracked across the yard. "Boss wants the black stallion. Saddled, now!" Will kept his movements unhurried, playing the role of the dim-witted stable hand. As he worked, he watched Harrison's right-hand man through lowered lashes. Bart had been asking questions in town, particularly about new faces in the territory. The stallion, a mean-spirited beast that only Harrison could ride, snapped at Will as he approached with the saddle. In the adjacent stall, Sarah's mare nickered softly. Will had hidden his latest note in her feed bag, but now he wondered if it had been too risky, if Harrison's suspicions were growing. "Having trouble there, boy?" Harrison's smooth voice froze. The blood in Will's veins. The snake stood in the stable doorway watching Will struggle with his stallion, but it was the man beside him that made Will's pulse race. Sheriff Davies from 3 counties over. The same sheriff who'd sworn him in as a deputy 2 months ago. Will kept his head down, adjusting straps with exaggerated care. If Davies recognized him, everything would unravel. Sarah would pay the price. "New hands slow," Bart reported. "But good with the horses." Harrison moved closer and Will felt those cold eyes studying him. "Where did you say you were from, Turner?" "Texas, sir, Coleman County." Will thickened his drawl, made himself sound slower, simpler. "Worked the bar tea spread for it went under." "Coleman County." Harrison's voice was thoughtful. "Sheriff Davies. He was just telling me about some interesting happenings in Coleman. Wasn't there some trouble with lawmen going missing?" Will's hand tightened on the saddle strap. "Wouldn't know, sir. Don't pay much mind to such things." The tension stretched like a horsehair about to snap. Then Sarah's voice rang out across the yard. "Mr. Harrison, father's letter has arrived." The distraction worked. Harrison's attention shifted immediately, his ego unable to resist news from his new father-in-law. As the men left the stable, Will caught Sarah's eye through the window. The fear there matched his own. That evening, Will made his riskiest move yet. While Harrison was occupied with his weekly business meeting, Will slipped into the ranch office. The safe behind the desk held enough evidence to hang Harrison 10 times over, if Will could just get to it. He was halfway through the combination when a floorboard creaked behind him. Will spun, hand dropping to his hidden gun, only to find Sarah in the doorway. "Harrison's coming," she whispered urgently. "One of his men saw a light." Will doused the lamp and pulled her into the shadows just as voices approached. They stood pressed together in the darkness, barely breathing, as Harrison and Davies passed by the office window. "Don't trust him," Davies was saying. "Something about that stable hand already taken care of." Harrison's voice was satisfied. "Sent a wire to Coleman. If he's not who he says he is, we'll know by morning." Sarah's hand found Will's in the darkness, squeezing in warning. They both knew what happened to people Harrison suspected of betrayal. Come morning, Will's carefully constructed cover would shatter like a mirror hit by a bullet. The price of freedom, Will realized, had just gone up. They were out of time. Midnight painted the ranch in shadows as Sarah crept through the darkened house. Her heart thundered so loudly she feared it would wake Harrison, but his side of the bed remained empty. He was still in his study, poring over ledgers with his men. The wire from Coleman would arrive with tomorrow's mail coach. They couldn't wait that long. She'd packed little: her mother's photograph, a change of clothes, the money she'd saved for school, the wedding ring she left on the bedside table, her final act of defiance. As she slipped down the back stairs, every creak sounded like a gunshot. The stable doors were already open when she arrived, Will's shadow moving purposefully among the horses. He'd prepared 4 mounts, her mare, his own horse, and 2 fresh ones for when they needed to switch. In the darkness, she could finally see him as he truly was, the dim-witted stable hand act stripped away. He moved with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to danger. "Ready?" he whispered, helping her mount. Before she could answer, a door slammed in the main house. Lanterns flared to life, voices raised in alarm. "The study!" Sarah gasped. "They must have found the safe open." Will's face hardened. "Time's up." He swung into his saddle. "Stay close to me, no matter what happens." They burst from the stable. Just as the first shouts of alarm went up, gunfire erupted behind them, bullets whining past like angry wasps. Will led them not toward the main gate, surely guarded, but toward a section of fence he'd weakened over the past week. The horses crashed through the weathered rails. Sarah ducked low over her mare's neck as more shots rang out. Behind them, she heard Harrison's voice rising above the chaos. "Bring her back alive! Kill him!" The night swallowed them as they rode hard across the open country. Will set a punishing pace, but Sarah's years of riding thunder had prepared her for this. They crossed 3 streams to confuse the pursuit, switched to the fresh horses at a full gallop, a trick Will must have learned from his time hunting outlaws. Dawn found them, in rocky terrain, the sounds of pursuit finally fading. Will led them into a narrow canyon, then up a nearly invisible trail to a sheltered cave. Inside, Sarah was surprised to find supplies already cached: food, ammunition, even medical supplies. "You've been planning this," she said as they tended to the horses. Will nodded, checking the canyon below for signs of pursuit. "Since the day I saw you in that carriage. Couldn't stand seeing you caged like that." He paused, then added softly, "Though I didn't plan on caring so much about the rescue." Heat bloomed in Sarah's cheeks. But before she could respond, Will stiffened. Voices echoed from the canyon below. Harrison's men, splitting up to search. "The hills, they're too close," Will muttered. "We need to move." But as they led the horses out, a rifle cracked from above. Bart and 2 others had circled around, cutting off their escape route. Will shoved Sarah behind a boulder as bullets sparked off the rocks around them. "Give her up, lawman," Bart called. "Boss says you can still ride away from this." Will's answer was a carefully aimed shot that sent Bart ducking for cover. "Sarah," he said quietly, reloading, "there's a trail down the back side. Take it north. Follow the morning star. There's a marshal's station in—" "No." The word surprised them both. "I won't leave you here, Sarah. I'm done letting men make my choices for me." She pulled her father's old revolver from her saddlebag. She'd taken it from Harrison's gun cabinet the night before. "We escape together, or not at all." Something flickered in Will's eyes, respect, admiration, and something warmer. Then his expression hardened as more of Harrison's men appeared below. "Together then," he said, "but we do this my way." What followed was a masterclass in frontier warfare. Will had them separate the horses, sending them in different directions to draw fire and attention. They used the maze-like canyon to their advantage, drawing their pursuers into crossfires of their own making. Sarah proved a better shot than Will expected. Years of hunting with her father hadn't been wasted. When the last of their ammunition was spent, they made their final break for freedom. 2 fresh horses, a desperate ride across open ground with bullets singing around them. Behind them, Harrison's furious roar echoed off the canyon walls. They were free, but freedom, Sarah knew, would come with a price. Harrison would never stop hunting them. Her father's men would join the chase. They were riding into a future as uncertain as the desert wind, with nothing but their horses, their wits, and their trust in each other. But as the sun rose fully over the horizon, painting the desert in gold, Sarah felt no regret. For the first time since her wedding day, she was choosing her own path. And the man riding beside her, he was part of that choice too. The desert sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah and Will pushed their horses through the unforgiving terrain. 3 days had passed since their escape from Harrison's ranch, each mile purchased with sweat and vigilance. They traveled by night when possible, but water needs forced them to move in the scorching day more often than Will liked. "We need to rest the horses," Will said, guiding them toward a cluster of rocks that offered some shade. "They won't last." Another hour in this heat. Sarah dismounted, her legs shaky from hours in the saddle. Despite her experience as a rider, she'd never attempted anything like this sustained flight. Will had shown her tricks for conserving water, reading the landscape, covering their tracks, skills she absorbed with desperate attention. "Harrison will have telegraphed every town within 100 miles, Will said, checking his dwindling ammunition. "We'll need to avoid settlements, at least until we're out of his immediate reach." "How far is that?" Sarah passed him the canteen, careful not to waste a drop. "A man like Harrison? His reach goes as far as his money." Will's face was grim, and his pride won't let him lose what he considers his property. The word made Sarah shudder. "I was never his property." "No," Will agreed softly. "You weren't." He busied himself with the horses, but Sarah caught something in his voice that made her heart skip. As they shared a meager lunch of jerky and hardtack, Sarah studied her companion openly for the first time. The simple, stable hand act had hidden so much. His natural grace, his quick intelligence, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. Even trail-worn and dust-covered, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that made her feel safer than she had in weeks. "Why did you really come to Harrison's ranch?" she asked finally. The truth this time. Will was silent for a long moment, watching the heat waves dance across the desert. "I've been tracking Harrison for 2 years. He killed my partner, Maid. It looked like a robbery gone wrong. But Tom was getting close to exposing Harrison's connection to the territorial governor." His hands clenched. "When I heard about your forced marriage, I knew it was my chance to infiltrate his operation." "I was your way in," Sarah said, understanding dawning. At first, Will met her eyes. "Then I saw you at that dinner, wearing your courage like armor. And He looked away. "The mission got complicated." Before Sarah could respond, Will tensed. In the distance, dust rose from multiple riders moving fast. "Mount up," he said tersely. "They found our trail." They rode hard through the afternoon, taking every trick Will knew to throw off pursuit. Up dry creek beds, across rocky ground that held no tracks, doubling back and splitting up only to rejoin later. But their horses were tired, and Harrison's. Men had fresh mounts. As dusk approached, they found themselves forced toward a box canyon. "We can't let them trap us," Will said, studying the terrain. "There's a narrow trail up the side. Might be our only chance." The path was barely wide, enough for a horse. Sarah's mare picked her way carefully, loose rocks clattering into the growing darkness below. Behind them, shouts echoed as their pursuers discovered their tracks. Halfway up, Sarah's mare stumbled. The horse recovered, but Sarah's saddlebag slipped, tumbling down the slope. Her mother's photographed their spare ammunition, gone in an instant. "Leave it," Will ordered, as she instinctively started to turn back. "We can't." Gunfire erupted from below. Will's horse screamed, blood blooming on its shoulder. The animal reared in panic, nearly sending Will over the edge. Sarah watched in horror as he fought for control on the narrow trail. "Go!" Will shouted, his horse still dancing dangerously close to the drop. "I'll hold them here." "Not without you," Sarah called back, echoing her words from their escape. Something passed between them then, an understanding deeper than words. Together, they urged their horses up the treacherous path as bullets sparked off the rocks around them. At the top, they found what Will had hoped for, a maze of ravines and passages that could help them lose their pursuers in the gathering dark. But as They paused to let their horses catch their breath. Sarah saw the blood soaking Will's sleeve. He'd been hit during the climb, yet hadn't said a word. Their eyes met in the twilight, both knowing that injury out here, with Harrison's men behind them and unknown dangers ahead, could be a death sentence. Without a word, Sarah tore strips from her petticoat for bandages. Whatever came next, they would face it together. She was done letting fear rule her life. Night fell in the high country, bringing with it a bone-deep chill that made Will's wounded arm throb mercilessly. They'd found shelter in a shallow cave, just deep enough to hide the small fire Sarah insisted on building to ward off the cold. In its flickering light, she examined his wound with gentle fingers. "The bullet went clean through," she said, relief evident in her voice, "but it's starting to show signs of infection." Will watched her work, remembering how she'd learned to treat wounds by helping the ranch hands back home. Another surprise. About this woman who kept defying his expectations. "We need to reach Silver Creek," he said. "There's a doctor there who doesn't ask questions. And Harrison won't look for us in a town so close to his territory," Sarah added, understanding his logic. She tied off the bandage, her touch lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "It's risky, but we don't have a choice." A wolf howled in the distance, answered by another closer call. Sarah tensed, but Will recognized the sound for what it was. "That's not wolves," he said grimly. "Harrison's men are using signals to coordinate their search." They doused the fire and moved deeper into the cave, leading the horses with them. In the darkness, Sarah's shoulder pressed against Will's good arm, her warmth both comforting and distracting. They waited in tense silence as hoofbeats approached their hidden sanctuary. "Tracks lead this way," Bart's voice carried clearly in the night air. "Check those caves." Sarah's hand found Will's in the darkness, squeezing tight. He squeezed back, trying to convey reassurance he didn't entirely feel. His gun arm was nearly useless, and they had precious little ammunition left. Lantern light swept the cave entrance. Will held his breath, knowing their horses might give them away with a single nervous sound. But Sarah was already moving, her hands gentle on the animals' muzzles, whispering soothing words, too soft to hear. "Nothing here," someone called. "Just an old bear den." The lantern light withdrew. Slowly, the sound of horses moved away, but Will didn't relax. "They'll have left men to watch," he whispered. "We'll wait an hour, then slip out the back way I spotted earlier." "There's a back way," Sarah whispered back, surprise and admiration in her voice. "First rule of survival, always know your escape route." He smiled in the darkness. "Something tells me you understand that better than most." "I spent years planning escapes from my father's control," she admitted. "But I never had the courage to use them, not until you came along." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Will was acutely aware of her closeness, the soft sound of her breathing, the faint scent of roses that somehow lingered despite days on the trail. It would be so easy to turn his head, to find her lips in the darkness. A stone clattered outside the cave. They froze, the moment broken. But it was only a mountain sheep, its form visible in the moonlight that now filtered through the cave. "Entrance, time to move," Will said, his voice rougher than he intended. They led the horses through the narrow back passage he'd discovered, emerging into a starlit night on the other side of the ridge. They rode hard for 2 hours, making use of every trick Will knew to obscure their trail. But the effort took its toll on his wounded arm, and by the time they stopped to rest, he was swaying in the saddle. "You're burning up," Sarah said, helping him dismount. Her cool hand on his forehead confirmed the fever she'd feared. "We need to reach that doctor soon." "Silver Creek's still a day's ride," Will said, fighting to focus through the growing haze of fever. "And Harrison's men will be watching the direct routes." Sarah's face set with determination. "Then we'll make our own route." She began unpacking what remained of their medical supplies. "But first, you need to rest. I'll take first watch." "Sarah," Will caught her hand as she turned away. "If something happens to me, you need to be ready to go on alone. Head north." She pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. "Stop talking like that. We escaped together. We'll survive together." Her eyes held his in the starlight, fierce and certain. "I didn't choose freedom just to lose you to a bullet and a fever." The word choose echoed in Will's mind as exhaustion finally pulled him toward unconsciousness. She'd chosen this path, chosen him, and as her cool hands tended his fever through the night, he realized he'd do anything to prove worthy of that choice. Silver Creek emerged from the morning mist like a mirage, a handful of buildings clinging to existence in the harsh territory. Will's fever had worsened through the night, and Sarah had to help him stay mounted as they approached the town. His skin burned beneath her touch, and his usually sharp eyes were glazed with pain. "Doc Matthews," he mumbled, pointing weakly toward a weathered building at the edge of town. "Old army surgeon. Patched me up before." Sarah scanned the quiet streets for signs of Harrison's men as they rode to the doctor's house. The town seemed peaceful enough, but she'd learned to distrust peaceful surfaces. A woman hanging laundry watched them too intently. A man cleaning his storefront paused too long in his work. The doctor's door opened before they could knock, revealing a gruff-faced man with silver hair. "Wondered when you'd show up, Stone," he said, helping Sarah get Will inside. "Word's been spreading about Harrison's runaway bride and a mysterious lawman. Can you help him?" Sarah asked, watching as Matthews examined Will's wound. The doctor's face was grim. "Infection's set in bad. He needs medicine I don't have." He looked at Sarah carefully. "But Hank at the general store keeps a supply. For the right price." "I have money," Sarah said, reaching for her remaining funds. "Not that kind of price, miss." Matthews glanced at Will, who had lapsed into fevered unconsciousness. "Hank's been in Harrison's pocket for years. He'll want information." Sarah straightened. "Her spine? Then I'll get it myself." "Sarah, no!" Will stirred, trying to rise. "Can't trust. Trust me," she said firmly, pressing him back down. "I learned deception at my father's dinner table. I can handle one corrupt shopkeeper." The general store bell jingled as Sarah entered, her heart pounding beneath her carefully composed expression. Hank, a thin man with calculating eyes, looked up from his ledger. "Mrs. Harrison," he said, unsurprised, "or do you prefer Miss Mitchell now?" "I prefer to do business," Sarah replied coldly, channeling her father's negotiating voice. "I need medicine. You have it. Name your price." "Information," Hank said, moving closer. "Where's your companion headed? Which marshal's office does he report to?" Sarah let her shoulders slump, as if in defeat. "I don't know. He doesn't trust me with details." She blinked back tears that weren't entirely false. "I just want to go home. My father—" "Of course you do." Hank's voice oozed sympathy. "Tell you what, I'll send word to Harrison. Let him know where to find his bride. The lawman won't survive the night without medicine anyway." Sarah's hands clenched behind her back. How long before they come?" "Couple hours at most. Telegraph office is right here." Hank gestured to the back room. "I'll send the message, then get you that medicine." "Show of good faith," Sarah nodded, watching him disappear into the back. The moment he was gone, she vaulted over the counter, grabbing the medicine bottles she'd spotted earlier. She shoved them into her pockets just as Hank returned. "Message." "Sent," he said smugly. "Now about that medicine." But Sarah was already running, the bell jangling behind her. She heard Hank's shout of alarm, then the thunder of boots as others joined the pursuit. Harrison's men had been waiting in town all along. She burst into the doctor's house. "We have to go. They're coming." Matthews was already helping Will to his feet. "Back door," he ordered. "Horses are ready." "You knew?" Sarah asked, even as she supported Will's weight. "Hank's telegraph has been dead for months," Matthews said grimly. "Told you he was in Harrison's pocket. Figured he'd try something like this." They emerged into the alley behind the house. True to his word, their horses were saddled and waiting, along with fresh supplies. Will managed to mount with Sarah's help, though his face was grey with pain. "Here!" Sarah pressed the stolen medicine into Matthew's hands. "Quick, before they—" Gunfire erupted from both ends of the alley. Matthews went down with a cry of pain as Sarah's horse reared in panic. Through the chaos, she saw familiar faces. Closing in, Harrison's men, led by Bart himself. "Get out of here," Matthews shouted from the ground, drawing a hidden pistol and returning fire. "I'll hold them off." Sarah hesitated, but Will grabbed her reins. "He's right. Ride!" They galloped out of the alley as Matthews' covering fire kept their enemies pinned down. Sarah's last glimpse of the old doctor was him reloading behind a water barrel, buying them time with his own blood. "Head for the high country," Will called, fighting to stay conscious as they rode. "There's a place, a safe place." But as they cleared the town, Sarah knew their troubles were far from over. Harrison's men would be right behind them, and now they had fresh horses and more men. The medicine in her pocket might save Will's life, but only if they lived long enough to use it. High in the mountains, Sarah found the shelter Will had spoken of, a forgotten trapper's cabin nestled in a grove of pines. As she helped him inside, his fever finally broke enough for him to speak coherently. The medicine she'd stolen was working, but they both knew they weren't safe yet. "There's something you need to know," Will said, watching her build a fire. "About Harrison, about your father." Sarah stilled, sensing the weight in his words. "Tell me. It's bigger than cattle rustling or protection rackets. Harrison's building an empire out here, one built on more than just fear." Will's voice was tight with pain and urgency. "He's got judges in his pocket, territorial officials on his payroll. Even your father's water rights scheme was part of something larger." "What do you mean?" "The railroad's coming through." Will sat up straighter, grimacing. "New line from Texas to California. Harrison's been buying up land along the proposed route, or forcing people out. Your father's water rights, they control every water source the railroad would need." Sarah's mind raced, pieces falling into place. That's why he wanted the marriage. "My father's lands were the missing piece. More than that, your father's connections to the territorial governor, Harrison needed those too. But Thomas Mitchell was proving reluctant to fully commit to Harrison's schemes, so he used me as leverage." Sarah's voice was bitter. "To ensure my father's cooperation. The governor's signing over land grants next month. With those, Harrison will control not just the territory, but the future of the entire region." Will reached for her hand. "That's why he won't let you go. Sarah, you're his guarantee that your father won't back out." A sound outside made them both freeze. Sarah moved to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. The moon had risen, painting the forest in silver shadows. "There's more," Will said quietly. "About your mother's death." Sarah turned sharply. "What about it?" "It wasn't fever that killed her." Will's eyes held infinite sadness. "She was asking questions about your father's business dealings with Harrison. About missing funds, forged documents. She threatened to go to the authorities." The world tilted beneath Sarah's feet. "No, father wouldn't." Harrison made it look like natural causes. "Your father only found out afterward, but by then..." Will trailed off, letting her complete the terrible picture herself. He was already in too deep. Sarah sank to the floor, memories realigning themselves with brutal clarity. Her father's sudden change after her mother's death, his drinking, his rage, his obsession with expanding the ranch. It hadn't been grief driving him, it had been guilt. "That's why he gave me to Harrison," she whispered. "He was already under his control." "Sarah." Will started to rise, but she waved him back. "All this time, I thought father was just ambitious. Cruel, perhaps, but at least purposeful." Her laugh was hollow. "Instead, he was just a coward, selling his daughter to protect himself. He was a man caught in a snake's coils," Will said gently, "making one bad choice after another, each worse than the last." Before Sarah could respond, a flicker of movement caught her eye. Through the window she saw it, a flash of lamplight among the trees, quickly doused. "They've found us," she breathed. Will struggled to his feet, checking his gun. "There's a cellar door hidden under that bearskin rug. Leads to a tunnel the trappers used for storing furs. You're not healed enough to ride. Don't have a choice." His eyes met hers in the firelight. "Sarah, if anything happens..." "Nothing will happen," she cut him off fiercely. "We know the truth now. That's worth something." Worth our lives? Will asked softly. Sarah thought of her mother, of all the lives Harrison had destroyed, of the empire of corruption he was building. Worth more, she said, worth fighting for. Outside, the night filled with the soft sounds of men trying to move quietly through forest. The hunters had found their prey, but this time Sarah swore the prey would bite back. The tunnel beneath the cabin was narrow and damp, forcing them to move single file through the darkness. Behind them, the sounds of Harrison's men searching the cabin filtered through the earth. Sarah led their horses while Will kept watch, his breathing labored from the effort of movement. They emerged into a small box canyon, the moon providing just enough light to navigate. But as they mounted their horses, a familiar voice froze Sarah's blood. Sarah! Thomas Mitchell stepped from the shadows, rifle trained on Will. That's far enough. Father? Sarah's voice cracked. How Harrison's men aren't the only ones who can track. Her father's face was haggard, aged decades in the weeks since she'd last seen him. Come home, Sarah, before this gets worse. Worse than selling me to a murderer? The words tasted like poison. Worse than letting him kill Mother? Thomas Mitchell flinched as if struck. You don't understand. I understand everything. Sarah's voice was ice. Every water rights deal, every forced sale. How many lives have you helped Harrison destroy, Father? How many families driven from their homes? I did it to protect you. He took a step forward, rifle wavering. After your mother, Harrison knew everything. He would have ruined us, imprisoned me. What would have happened to you then? So you gave me to him instead. Sarah felt Will tense beside her, ready to move despite his weakness. She touched his arm lightly. Wait, he promised you'd be safe. Her father's voice cracked. Protected. Provided for. Like Mother was protected. Sarah saw the bullet strike home. Did Harrison promise that too before he killed her? The rifle drooped toward the ground. I didn't know about your mother, not until after. Harrison, he showed me proof. Said if I didn't cooperate, the same proof would show I was responsible. So you bought your freedom with my life. Sarah, please. Thomas Mitchell's face was wet with tears. Come home. I'll fix this. Somehow. How? Will's quiet voice cut through the night. Harrison owns you, Mitchell. Owns every piece of paper that could send you to prison. You really think he'll let either of you go? The rifle came back up. You're the one who turned her against me. No, Father. Sarah urged her horse forward, placing herself between Will and the rifle. You did that yourself. Every time you chose Harrison's blood money over what was right, every time you looked away from what he was doing, every time you remembered how Mother really died and said nothing, movement in the trees, Harrison's men closing in. They had moments at most. Father, Sarah's voice softened. Help us. Help us stop him. We can end this. For a moment she saw her father as he once was, the man who had taught her to ride, who had loved her mother with his whole heart. The man he could have been if fear hadn't poisoned his soul. Then his face hardened. Harrison! He shouted. There, Will's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the air. Ride! Will snapped, wheeling his horse. They galloped out of the canyon as gunfire erupted behind them. Sarah didn't look back at her father's crumpled form, at the last bridge burning behind her. Her choice was made. Harrison will kill him, she said as they rode. No. Will's voice was grim. He's too useful alive, a reminder to others what happens when you cross the snake. Sarah felt something hard settle in her chest. Her father had chosen his fate, just as she was choosing hers. But as they rode into the night, pursued by Harrison's bullets and her father's sins, she swore that choice would end differently. Behind them, her father's betrayal lit up the night like a signal fire. Ahead lay only darkness and hope. Dawn found them in an abandoned mining camp, the kind of place where dreams of gold had died years ago. Will's fever had finally broken completely, his strength returning with each passing hour. They'd managed to lose Harrison's immediate pursuit, but both knew it was only temporary. "The governor's signing those land grants in 3 days," Will said, spreading out a worn map he'd kept hidden in his saddlebag. "Harrison's men will be escorting him to the territorial capital by the old stage road." Sarah studied the map, her finger tracing the route. "Through Snake Pass. It's the only way they can make it in time." "Exactly." Will's eyes held a fierce light. "And I've got proof of Harrison's entire operation. Letters, bank drafts, witness statements, everything needed to bring him down. But we have to get it to the right people," Sarah finished, "before Harrison can complete his plan." Will nodded grimly. "The territorial marshal will be at the signing. If we can get the evidence to him, Harrison will have men watching every approach." Sarah's mind raced, remembering details from her brief time as the snake's wife. "He's paranoid about the pass, says it's too easy to ambush." "He would know." Will's voice was dark. "He's used it that way himself, often enough." They spent the morning planning, drawing on Will's law enforcement experience and Sarah's intimate knowledge of Harrison's operation. The mining camp yielded unexpected treasures, abandoned tools, dynamite for blasting, even a few rounds of ammunition that matched Will's gun. "Harrison will expect us to hit the governor's party directly," Will said as they prepared the horses. "He'll have his best, and they're watching for exactly that." Sarah checked her father's revolver, now fully loaded. "Then we don't do what he expects. It's risky." Will caught her arm, turned her to face him. "Sarah, if this goes wrong, then we fail trying to do what's right." She met his eyes steadily. "Better that than living under Harrison's boot." Will's hand moved from her arm to her face, calloused fingers gentle against her cheek. For a moment, the world narrowed to just this: his touch, his eyes, the way her heart raced at his closeness. "When this is over," he said softly, "if we survive." Hoofbeats in the distance shattered the moment. They sprang apart, weapons ready, but it was a single rider approaching with hands raised. Doc Matthews, arm in a sling but very much alive. "Figured I'd find you here," the old doctor said, dismounting stiffly. "Harrison's got the whole territory looking for you two, offering rewards, spreading stories about a dangerous criminal kidnapping. His beloved wife." "How did you escape?" Sarah asked, helping him sit. "Harrison's men aren't as thorough as they think. And I've got friends of my own." Matthews produced a package from his saddlebag, "including some who want to see Harrison fall. As much as you do." The package contained ammunition, medical supplies, and most precious of all, official papers with the territorial marshal's seal. "There's a group of lawmen gathering," Matthews explained. "Been building a case against Harrison for months. Will's evidence is the last piece they need. But they can't move until they have proof of the railroad connection." "The land grants," Will said. "If Harrison gets those signed, he'll be untouchable." Matthew's face was grim. Too many powerful men involved. Too much money at stake. "It has to end at Snake Pass." They spent the afternoon refining their plan, Matthews adding his knowledge of the territory and its people. As the sun began to set, the old doctor prepared to leave. "Harrison's got 50 men at least," he warned, "not counting whatever local muscle he's hired. You'll be outnumbered. Quality over quantity," Will said, but his eyes were worried as he watched Sarah check their supplies. Matthews caught the look. "You love her," he said quietly. "That obvious?" "To everyone but her, probably." The doctor mounted carefully. "Good. Love's the only thing I've seen that's stronger than fear, and fear is how Harrison controls everyone." As Matthews rode away, Sarah joined Will at the edge of the camp. Together they watched the sun sink behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors of blood and gold. "Tomorrow," she said softly. Will's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. "Tomorrow." Neither spoke of the odds against them, of all the ways their plan could fail. They had truth on their side, and justice, and something else neither dared name yet. It would have to be enough. Snake Pass lived up to its name, a twisted trail through rocky peaks where 1,000 places offered ambush. Dawn mist clung to the cliffs as Sarah and Will positioned themselves above the narrowest point. Below, Harrison's men were already. taking up positions to guard the governor's approach. I count 20 riders, Will murmured, studying the scene through his field glasses. Plus, whatever men he's got hidden in the rocks. More coming, Sarah whispered, pointing to dust clouds. In the distance. That'll be the governor's party. Harrison will be with them. They'd spent the night placing charges at strategic points along the pass, not to kill, but to trap and separate Harrison's forces. The territorial marshal's men were supposedly in position on the far side, waiting for Will's signal. If everything went according to plan, they'd catch Harrison's entire operation in a net of their own making. But as Sarah watched more riders arrive below, her heart sank. There's too many. Even with the marshal's men, we stick to the plan, Will said firmly. Get the evidence to the marshal. Let him arrest Harrison legally. That's the only way to make it stick. A rider broke away from the new arrivals, heading up a trail toward their position. Sarah's breath caught as she recognized the silhouette. Father, she breathed. Thomas Mitchell's arm was still in a sling from Will's bullet, but he sat his horse with familiar determination. He was alone, either very brave or very foolish. Cover me, Will said, rising, but don't shoot unless he forces me to, Sarah finished. I know. She watched through her rifle sights as Will stepped into view, blocking her father's path. The two men faced each other, hands near weapons. Mitchell, Will called, here to betray your daughter again, here to save her life. Thomas Mitchell's voice carried clearly in the morning air. Harrison knows you're planning something. He's got men everywhere, watching every approach. You can't win this. Already sent riders for help. Will lied smoothly. Marshall's men will be here within the hour. No, they won't. Mitchell's face was haunted. Harrison found your friends in town, the doctor, the others who were helping you. They're all dead. Sarah's heart turned to ice. Doc Matthews, their allies, all gone? It couldn't be true. You're lying, Will said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Wish I was. Mitchell swung down from his horse, hands raised. Harrison's done playing games. He wants Sarah back, wants you dead, and doesn't care how many people he has to kill to make it happen. As if to punctuate his words, gunfire erupted from the cliffs above, positions they thought were secure. Will dove for cover as bullets sparked. Off rocks around him, Sarah's rifle snapped up, picking out muzzle flashes in the shadows. 2 shots, 2 cries of pain. Sarah! Her father's voice was desperate. Please, while there's still time. More riders were appearing on the ridges around them. Their carefully planned trap was becoming a noose. Will, Sarah called. The charges! He nodded grimly, reaching for the detonator, but before he could trigger it, a new voice cut through the chaos. I wouldn't. Jake Harrison stepped into view on a ledge above them, rifle aimed at Will's back. Drop it, lawman. Nice and easy. Sarah swung her rifle toward him, but Harrison just smiled. Careful, dear wife. My men have some interesting news about Rosa's family in Mexico. Would be a shame if anything happened to them. He's bluffing. Will called, but his hands moved away from the detonator. Am I? Harrison's smile widened. Tell her, Thomas. Tell her what happens to people who cross me. Sarah's father seemed to age decades before her eyes. It's true, all of it. The doctor, Rosa's family, the marshal's men. Harrison's been 2 steps ahead the whole time. Thanks to you, Sarah said. Bitterly understanding dawning. You've been feeding him information since we escaped. I had no choice, Mitchell's voice broke. He said he'd let you live if I helped him. Said he'd forgive your running away. And you believed him? Will's laugh was harsh. After everything he's done? Harrison's men were closing in now, emerging from hiding places all around them. Their perfect plan lay in ruins, betrayed by her own father's desperate attempts to save her. Last chance, Sarah, Harrison called. Surrender now, I'll let the lawman live. Fight and I'll kill him slowly while you watch. Sarah met Will's eyes across the distance between them. In them, she saw everything they'd never said, everything they'd hoped for after this was over. She saw love and trust and a question. Her answer was a single word, pitched for his ears alone. Together. The world exploded. In the split second after Sarah's whispered together, Will had understood. Even as Harrison's men closed in, his hand found the second detonator. The one they'd hidden as a last resort. The one Sarah's father hadn't known. About to betray, the charges they'd set along the lower pass erupted, sending horses rearing and men scrambling for cover. Sarah's rifle cracked twice, taking down the men nearest Harrison before he could react. The snake dove for cover, losing his commanding position as rocks tumbled around him. "Kill them!" Harrison's voice rose above the chaos. "Kill them both!" But Sarah and Will were already moving, using the confusion to reach their cached horses. Years of riding thunder had prepared Sarah for this moment. She swung into the saddle at a gallop, gun still blazing. Beside her, Will matched her pace, their horses racing along the narrow trail they'd scouted the night before. "This wasn't the plan," Will shouted over the gunfire. "Plans change," Sarah called back. "Besides," she twisted in her saddle, dropping another of Harrison's men, "you love it." The admission hung between them as they rode, punctuated by bullets whining past. Behind them, Harrison was rallying his men, but the explosions had done their work. The pass was partially blocked, forcing their pursuers to split up. They reached the second ambush point just as the governor's party appeared below. Sarah saw the territorial governor himself, surrounded by armed guards, staring up at the chaos in confusion. "Perfect! Now!" Will commanded. They triggered the remaining charges, not to kill or trap this time, but to create a barrier of flame and smoke. In the confusion, they swung down into the governor's party, guns leveled. Governor Evans. Will's voice carried authority even in the chaos. "You're riding with a wanted man. Jake Harrison is—" Gunfire cut him off. Harrison's men had reached them, led by Bart. The governor's guards returned fire, not sure who was friend or foe. Horses screamed, men shouted, and the narrow pass became a cauldron of lead and chaos. Sarah lost track of Will in the melee. She found herself facing Bart, his gun aimed at her heart. "Nothing personal, Mrs. Harrison," he sneered. "Just business." A shot rang out. Bart's expression froze in surprise as he toppled from his horse. Behind him stood Thomas Mitchell, her father's smoking gun still raised. "Sarah!" he shouted. "The evidence! Give it to the governor! I'll hold them!" A bullet took him in the chest. He fell as Harrison himself emerged from the smoke, gun trained on his fallen former partner. "Should have stayed loyal, Thomas," the snake said coldly. "No!" Sarah's scream of rage carried over the gunfire. Her horse responded to her urgency, charging straight at Harrison. The snake's eyes widened in surprise as she bore down on him. His shot went wide as her mare's shoulder slammed into his horse, sending both animals and riders tumbling. Sarah rolled clear, coming up with her father's revolver ready. Harrison was faster, his gun swinging toward her. Time seemed to slow as she stared down the barrel, seeing her death in those cold eyes. 2 shots rang out as one. Harrison's bullet burned across her arm, but Will's shot, fired from where he'd fought his way to high ground, took the snake high in the shoulder. Harrison fell, his gun flying from nerveless fingers. "Sarah!" Will's voice held terror. "The governor!" She turned to see Governor Evans pinned down with his guards, cut off from escape by Harrison's remaining men. This was their chance, if they could just get the evidence to him. Sarah snatched the package of documents from her saddlebag and broke cover, running toward the governor's position. Bullets kicked up dust around her feet. Behind her, she heard Will providing covering fire, heard Harrison shouting orders through the pain of his wound. She was halfway there when she saw movement. Too late. One of Harrison's men, hidden in the rocks, swung his rifle toward her. There was no time to dodge, no cover to reach. A shadow passed over her. Her father, somehow still alive, threw himself into the bullet's path. They fell together as Will's answering shot took down the ambusher. "Sarah!" Thomas Mitchell's voice was weak, blood staining his shirt. "The letter in my pocket. Harrison's confession about your mother." Understanding dawned. Her father had been playing a deeper game all along, gathering his own evidence even while seeming to betray them. With shaking hands, she found the letter, added it to the package. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for everything. So sorry. No," she said, holding him as his breathing slowed. "I know, Father." A familiar voice rang out over the chaos. "U.S. Marshal, drop your weapons." Sarah looked up to see riders pouring into the pass. Doc Matthews, very much alive, leading a force of marshals. Her father's final deception revealed he'd lied about their allies being dead, buying them time for reinforcements to arrive. Harrison's men, caught between the marshals and the governor's guards, began throwing down their weapons, but the snake himself had one last strike. Sarah saw him rise, saw the derringer appear in his hand, aimed not at her but at Will. Her father's revolver barked one last time. Harrison fell, a look of surprise frozen on his face, his hidden gun unfired. Sarah's last bullet had found its mark right through the snake's heart. As the marshals took control of the scene, Will reached her side. Together they handed the evidence to Governor Evans, proof of Harrison's crimes, the railroad conspiracy, and her mother's murder. Her father's final letter completed the package, his testimony from beyond death, sealing Harrison's legacy of corruption. Thomas Mitchell died in his daughter's arms, his last sight the justice he'd helped deliver. Sarah felt Will's strong hand on her shoulder, supporting her as she grieved for the father she'd lost twice, once to fear and now to courage. "He made it right," Will said softly. "In the end." Sarah stood, facing the future with clear eyes. "Yes," she said, "and so did we." The sun broke through the smoke of battle, lighting the pass where so many threads of fate had finally unraveled. Harrison's empire lay in ruins, its architect dead by the hand of the woman he'd tried to cage. Justice had been served, truth revealed, and a daughter's journey from prisoner to victor completed. But as Will drew her into his arms, Sarah knew this wasn't really an ending. In his kiss, she tasted tomorrow and all the tomorrows after. She had won more than freedom. She had won the right to choose her own path, her own future, her own love. Behind them, Snake Pass began to fade into memory, taking its dark history with it. Ahead lay open country, and the promise of a love born in darkness, but destined to thrive in the light. 3 months after the battle at Snake Pass, Sarah stood at her mother's grave, fresh flowers in her hands. The autumn wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the promise of change. They'd buried her father next to his wife, together in death as they had once been in life. The Mitchell Ranch was hers now, though she'd already begun transforming it. The vast water rights her father had accumulated were being divided among the families Harrison had driven out. Displaced ranchers were returning, bringing with them new life to the territory. The railroad would still come through, but now it would serve the people rather than profit from them. "Thought I'd find you here," Will's voice came from behind her. He'd kept his marshal's badge, using it to help rebuild what Harrison had destroyed. But he'd also kept his promise to her, to face whatever came next, together. "Just saying goodbye," Sarah said, placing the flowers between the graves. "And thank you." Will's arms slipped around her waist, warm and secure. "Your father would be proud of all you've done, all you're still doing." "He died trying to make things right." Sarah leaned back against him. "Seems only fair to finish what he started." In the distance, they could see riders approaching the ranch. Rosa and her family returned from Mexico to help run the place. Other former workers were coming back too, drawn by stories of the woman who'd broken the snake's hold on the territory. "Speaking of finishing things," Will said, turning her to face him, "Doc Matthews rode in this morning. Brought something you might be interested in." From his pocket, he produced a piece of paper. Their marriage license, signed and official. They'd been waiting for the territorial courts to formally annul her marriage to Harrison, for all the legal tangles to unravel. "Seems you're finally free," Will said softly, "to make your own choice." Sarah took the paper, studied it in the fading light. Then, with deliberate care, She tore it in half. Will's face fell, but before he could step back, she grabbed his shirt and pulled him close. "I don't need a paper to choose you," she said. "I did that a long time ago in a cave with bullets flying and hope burning low. But if you're asking," his smile could have lit the darkest night. "I'm asking." Their kiss was witnessed only by the setting sun and two graves, monuments to the past that had led them here. But as they rode back to the ranch together, Sarah knew her mother would have approved. She'd found not just freedom, but the kind of love worth fighting for. The Mitchell ranch's gates stood open now, welcoming all who sought honest work and fair treatment. And if anyone asked about the woman who ran it, the one who'd married an outlaw and escaped with a lawman, who'd brought down an empire of corruption and reformed a territory, well, that was just another story of the Old West. But it was her story, and this time she'd written her own ending.